Good day, and thank you for joining this special Solstar Space livecast. We are excited to introduce our guest for today, Alan Stern. He is the principal investigator of the NASA New Horizons mission to explore Pluto and the Kuiper Belt, as well as a Virgin Galactic Astronaut and Solstar Space Advisor. Welcome to the show today, Alan. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Lisa. Appreciate the introduction. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, what an amazing career that you've had. Maybe you can start by giving us just a little bit of background on yourself. I'm sure there's way more to tell than we have time to talk about here today.
Well, very briefly, I'm that kid that was swept off my feet by space exploration and never wanted to do anything else. And I've been very fortunate to have a career that's got one foot in the exploration side and one foot in the commercial spaceflight side. And if I had a third foot, of course, that would be the science side. And I've got to do a lot of interesting things in my career, and this is one of them. And I'm really looking forward to your interview.
Absolutely. Well, you recently joined Solstar Space as an advisor, and we'd really like to understand what your primary reasons were for joining Solstar Space as an advisor.
Well, there are really two. One is that I'm a big believer in Solstar's founder and CEO, Brian Barnett. That made a big difference to me. But also, I think the most valuable thing that all of us have in our careers is time. There's only so many hours in the day, there's so many days in the week and weeks in the year. And I want to be as impactful as possible in my career in advancing space science and the commercialization of space and space exploration. And I feel like what uh, Solstar is doing with Brian at the lead is really pivotal, really changing the equation of how um, spacecraft, both crewed spacecraft and robotic spacecraft, can communicate in a way that's so fundamentally forward looking for the 21st century. It's so game changing that it's worth that value of the limited time that we all have. So I'm excited about them helping that become a realization for the 21st century. And that pretty much sums up why I'm putting time into it.
Excellent. Well, thank you. How do you see space Wi-Fi and space communications that Solstar is going to be rolling out here? How will that really change space communications for the future?
Great question. Um, when we started space exploration back in the mid 20th century as a species, it was a bit ahead of its time. It was driven by really a Cold War competition. And the technology of the 1950s and 60s and 70s was very primitive compared to today, but it's all we had. And so we were stuck with a lot of things that we don't want to be stuck with anymore. A good example is, rockets used to be disposable, and now rockets are reusable. And that's driven price points down and flight rates up, and it's opened a lot of new economic niches for commercialization of space. It used to be that only test pilots could fly in space, but we found out that many other kinds of people, from space tourists to scientists to artists and journalists and many other categories of people, can fly in space, and that's for the good. And similarly, what Solstar is doing is breaking the bonds that we've always had with satellites. By satellites, I mean everything in space, from the ISS down to the smallest CubeSat, being tied to some sort of ground network or a relay satellite up above, like a NASA TDRS satellite, and just changing that equation that we don't need to do store and forward and wait for ground stations, flyovers, and we aren't going to be capacity limited in the way that we used to be. So this is really game changing. It's a different way of thinking about things, but it's actually a way we're very familiar with ground networks, the way that our cell phones work. And it's time for the exploration and exploitation of space uh, to step into that same era that we've been in since the 90s with our cell phones.
Right. What do you see as some of the use cases that we can expect these Solstar solutions will be able to support?
Well, that I don't think we have time for that because I can't think of what's not a use case, right? Whether it's commercial LEO space stations, whether it's tourists flying in orbit or suborbitally, whether it's scientists flying in orbit or suborbitally, whether it's small satellites or giant constellations. The kind of capability that Solstar has the ambition to put in place, in which it's already been developing and bringing up the TRL ladder in the laboratory and also now with spaceflight demonstrations, it really can apply to every single application I can think of in spaceflight. And that doesn't just apply to Earth orbit, but also cislunar space. And someday it'll also affect what we do across the solar system, I hope.
Wow, that's just amazing. So you made your first space flight just fairly recently, a few months ago, back in November, the beginning of November. Can you tell us a little bit about the objectives of your mission?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my day job is at the Southwest Research Institute. That's a 75-year-old organization based in San Antonio, Texas, a nonprofit that does R&D across both the private sector and for government entities. We have a large space sector with over 500 people in it. And Southwest has been very forward-looking now for more than a decade in terms of bringing humans to space flight through commercial means. And this was our first flight, putting our toe in the water, if you will. It was largely a training flight for me to experience space flight, but we also had 9 separate mission objectives that had to be accomplished during the period of the flight from launch to landing. We got all 9 done, and my next flight will be NASA sponsored. I got selected in 2020, the very end of 2020, as the first researcher that NASA's Space Technology Mission Directorate selected to fly with an experiment on a commercial suborbital mission. That's a joint venture between Southwest Research Institute and NASA. And with a little luck, that'll happen later this year.
Wow. Okay. So very exciting. Now, what were some of the most surprising things that came about for your first space flight that maybe you weren't expecting?
Well, again, I don't know how much time we have. I guess I was really surprised about how easy I found it to accomplish the mission objectives, despite the fact we were surprised by some things. A good example is, on the Virgin Galactic spacecraft, all of the pointing and the attitude control is done by firing reaction control jets. That's very common in human spaceflight. And we were told in our training that we would hear those jets going off and even see them out the window sometimes. And that's all true. But what I didn't appreciate is that when the jets fire, the cabin will pivot and move. And so sometimes as you're translating across the cabin, the place that you're trying to get to will move further while you're in mid-flight from you, or it might move towards you and move up, and it's upon you a little sooner. And after the first couple times that happened, I very quickly could adapt to it. But I found it surprising at first. And it's the kind of thing, that's the reason we do these training flights. It's a luxury of commercial space flight. The price points are low enough that we can afford to do training flights that were really not possible in the past because prices were too high. But it's part of the normalization of space flight in the same way that Solstar is normalizing the way we communicate so that we're not tethered to ground networks. Commercial spaceflight is normalizing the types of people that can go to space so that scientists don't have to operate their experiments by remote control. And it's also normalizing the experience of spaceflight so that it becomes just another environment where people work. Volcanologists go to volcanoes, oceanographers go to the deep ocean, Geologists go all over the planet, even to the Arctic regions and to the South Pole. Astronomers go to telescopes. For us space scientists, for decades, we've been limited to working from mission control and having to automate everything. And now that we can go ourselves, that's a big simplification that's going to raise success rates and lower costs and reduce the number of failure modes. Same way, having these onboard communications links that Solstar is developing is going to be a much more robust way to communicate than we have in the past. And it's really stepping into the 21st century with that aspect, that's communications, which are fundamental to every spacecraft ever built.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are you looking forward to the most in your role as an advisor to Solstar Space?
Well, I think it's just helping the company find its footing in terms of new technology demonstrations and opening the markets. The same way that, at first, I'll give an example. A good example is SpaceX. People didn't think they could develop reusable rocketry. And once they did, a lot of people were a little skittish about using a used rocket. But SpaceX was able to properly position the story and say, look, if you were getting on a brand new airliner, and as you stepped on board, the captain or the host crew in the cabin said, welcome to this airplane. It's never flown before today, but we're looking forward to taking you on your first flight. You might be a little bit more skittish than if you got on an airliner that you knew had flown successfully hundreds or thousands of times. And so people have now adapted to realizing that reusable, flight-proven rockets are actually a better bet than taking a new piece of hardware out for the first time. Same way, I want to see what Solstar is doing, moving away from ground networks to this much more advanced system, much more capable and flexible system that involves satellite-to-satellite links, really become the norm over the next number of years.
Excellent. Well, I really want to thank you so much for being here with us today, Alan. We appreciate your insights and really looking forward to all the great work that you are going to be doing with Solstar Space.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. It's been a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you so much. And if you would like to learn more about Solstar Space, you can visit solstarspace.com. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks. Take care.